Can you imagine opening 115 locations, going through an acquisition of another 70, launching an e-commerce brand during COVID? Some might say that that takes guts, but my guest today would say it just takes the right team. Christina Russell is the CEO and founder of Radiance Holdings, which owns the beauty and wellness brands of Woodhouse Spas and Sola Salons. She spent most of her career, amazing career, in franchising, and she's learned that strategy will only go so far. It's the people that will really get you there. Christina, welcome to How I Turned the Corner.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, can you just start by sharing a little bit around your core value is joy, which I absolutely love. Can you, I mean, I'm sure that it wasn't just birthed that way. Can you talk about your journey and how you got to a place where you started to see that joy was such an important part of running a company?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny because I think oftentimes things like joy are dismissed. You hear a lot of times people will say, "Well, that feels fluffy," when you start talking about, something as important as joy. And when we founded the company Radiance back in 2020, it was sort of intuitive to me. It wasn't a great time, but when I had come into Sola back in 2019, what other business is as joyful as what we were doing? I mean, it's beauty services. And so I've said this across every business I've worked in, but when you're doing things that are really designed to improve the quality of life of the people that you're serving, you've got to do it with that sort of gusto. And I think you just find people, you surround yourself with people who value that, and it sort of happens organically. But yeah, in 2020, it was a pretty tough sell to some of the other executives in the company, but I was able to get it there. And I think it served us well in terms of recruiting and building the company that we built.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And especially with the people you are serving. I mean, you walk into a salon, yeah, you want to experience, I mean, you're there to relax and joy is like a big part of that. So if it's not built into the culture, your customers aren't going to have that experience.
For sure. And just for your listeners who may not be familiar with the Sola business model, Sola is really so much more than just a salon. It's very much like franchising generally, which is where I've spent, almost 25 years of my career. It's about helping people to achieve the American dream. And so you think about what that means. If I'm a hairstylist and I've made the investment to go to beauty school, that's probably a big deal for me. So these are generally not people who were college bound or have a whole lot of support. And they're looking for a way to get more out of that investment they made in beauty school, which is usually $25,000. And a lot of times they stall out, they end up in salons where they're not supported. And that's a real problem. But those who make their way to independence, they could see a real career out of this where they're earning six figures sometimes doing what they love. And often what they tell you is that it's really about the quality of life, the ability to spend more time with their family. So fundamentally, it's about joy. And franchising is exactly the same way. Oftentimes it's corporate refugees, people like me who left a career that maybe they were satisfied with, but they'd hit a glass ceiling or they just weren't really seeing the growth that they wanted to see anymore. And they wanted to do something different. And starting a franchise, suddenly you become a creator of jobs instead of just somebody who occupies a position within a company. And that can be really, really rewarding.
Hmm. So one thing I've always been a little bit curious about, though, with the franchise model is how do you, I guess, how do you push culture down through a franchise?
I think it's probably a misconception that culture gets pushed down. What I would say happens with founders, founders generally will have a phenomenal vision about what they want to create. And I've, through most of my life, been more of a Wozniak than a Jobs. I'm not the big visionary that comes up with ideas. So people like Gary Haven, who founded Curves, or Heidi Ganahl, who founded Camp Bow Wow here in Denver, or Carrie Dorr, who founded Pure Barre. These are real visionaries, people who have an idea that's just so rich about how to do something different in a particular market. And they take that idea and then find like-minded individuals to really drive the business forward. And that culture then becomes something that's ingrained, not just from the top down from the founder, but in the franchisees that are doing this in their individual markets. And over time, that becomes more and more important because if those choices are made right from the beginning, it's then the franchisees that are ones that carry the torch. So I think about this with a brand like Sola, where it had been through, the founders, grown significantly under the founders. And when they sold it to private equity, they brought me in. My first step in that company, in Heidi's company, in any of these companies, was to go in and try to understand the culture that they had built through the eyes of the franchisees and figure out how to take that culture, really strengthen that foundation, and make sure that we were ready for that next stage of growth without losing what those founders had really built it upon.
So how do you do that? I mean, how do you, because there's got to be also some consistency across the brands, I would think, so that the customer experience from location to location is somewhat consistent too.
It is. And I think that is the magic of really strong franchise brands. So in every brand I've done this with, my methodology has been really similar. And over time, I've been able to kind of hone in on the right approach to it. But I go out and I do something that I call the worries and wins tour. So I'm new to the brand and I need to understand, what are they worrying about and what are they winning on? Where do they see the company as winning? And then along with that, it's worries, wins, and then I call it words, just to keep the W theme, but worries, wins, and words. What are the words that you would use to describe your culture, your company? And let them say it organically. And, every company has that mission statement that sits on the website. And my question as I go in is, does that really mean anything to the hundreds of franchisees that are out there? And what impressed me so much, particularly with Camp Bow Wow, with Sola, with brands like this, you would go out and the words might not be precisely what was in that mission statement. It's not as if they were reciting something that they had memorized, but they were nailing exactly what that mission was about. With Camp Bow Wow, it was happy pets, happy people. It was a brilliant vision, and you would hear that over and over again. With Sola, it was 100% put the stylist first, and it was talking about empowering them to pursue the life of their dreams. And I think both of those things, when you think about it through a franchising lens, what is my job as a franchisor? Well, my customer isn't really that end customer. My customer is the franchisee. So if I understand what's important to them and aligns with what's important to me as a franchisor, we're going to be able to work together to really deliver something that ultimately does have consistency across the brand, not just operationally, but in terms of how we view people. And so it starts, though, with asking them. You've got to really understand it. And if it's not aligned, it's getting that alignment first.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of, one of the, well, I mean, a lot of my listeners will already know this, but you don't know this. But one of the things we also do at Turning the Corner is we support job seekers. We help them with their job hunt. And to my job seekers that are listening, please don't feel bad about this, but we don't really make very much money on this. It's not a moneymaker. It's really a loss leader for us. But I feel such an obligation to support job seekers because a job hunt is such a soul crushing experience. And AI has made it 10 times harder than it used to be. And anyway, that's neither here nor there. But one of the reasons I keep it as one of our lines of businesses is that I learned so much about what's really happening in the world from the job seekers. And I've learned over the years that the number one reason why someone truly hates a job is exactly what people say, which is a manager. It's not the job, it's not the company, it's the manager. And I really tested this out when I first opened up Turning the Corner because there's a lot of, I guess, just parochial things that are said, and you're kind of like, is that true? And yeah, it's totally true. Is a poorly trained manager, or a bad manager, which is really just a poorly trained manager. What do you do in your franchise, in your business, to make sure that the salon owners, the leaders, the people who are, managing the staff internally are going to be the best boss that they can be?
Yeah, with the team itself, where I saw this happening, and you're absolutely right. With Radiance, when we knew we were going to put together a platform, which is really the business that I helped to build, we knew the company was going to grow. So when I stepped into it in 2019, it was just Sola, and we had, oh gosh, I think 17 employees total for the whole company. When I left the company last year, I left and I think we had just over 200. So it was a big growth in a very short period of time during the pandemic. And that was the question: is we're going to be building a level of middle management that's really going to matter. What do we do to make sure that we do this right? And so what we understood from the beginning is that in much the same way as we do it in franchising, where we're trying to make sure that that culture is not lost and how we treat people matters across those hundreds of locations, The same thing was going to matter internally in terms of how our team was treated. So we structured the way that we interacted with our employees and made sure that there were a lot of a real two-way communication types of engagements with the team that were intended to understand what they needed as leaders. And we invested in that middle level of management. So we had our executive leadership, which was our C-suite. We had our all hands meetings, but what we added was a leadership team meeting. So anyone who was managing people would be involved in that leadership team meeting. And what we would talk about in that meeting is, how are you playing into that culture? Because those are the harder jobs in a company. I mean, I will honestly say, if you're in the C-suite, you know what's going on. You know all the decisions being made. You understand the why. And if you're down in the ranks of the company where you're less engaged with all of that, you don't really need to know all of that. But the middle managers, they do need to know it, but they're not always in the room. And so how do you get them in the room? And so when we would do our executive retreats, we would structure it so those quarterly retreats were followed by a leadership team retreat where we spoke to the leadership about what we came to and vetted it with them to make sure we understood their perspective on it and could fine tune our strategy based on their feedback, because they were the ones at the end of the day that were going to make the bigger difference in the team and culture than we could, because we were, obviously growing and we weren't going to be able to touch everyone in quite the same way. But I think giving that very flat feel to an organization, I think is super important. And you've got to have two-way communication to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think over the years I've been doing this, that middle management team is the team that will either break or make a culture.
100%.
If they're not on board, if they're not getting that communication, they're not getting the training, they're not loving their job, they're not connected to the why, the mission, the values, it's not going to work. The company's not going to work. Was that your experience too with that middle management team?
It always is. And it doesn't make it easier. Knowing that is like, it's great information, but a lot of times when you're dealing with middle management, you forget that you know things through experience that at some point in your career you didn't know. At some point in your career, things that are easy later were hard. And one of the things I often talk to my middle managers about was imposter syndrome, because in my generation, no one talked about that. You just thought you were the only person that was faking it until you make it. And the thing that I would always talk to them about is that it never goes away. So I think they have this impression that you're going to get to a moment in your career where suddenly you just feel comfortable. And the reality is, if you get to that moment in your career, it's probably time to move up. It's probably time to move forward. And I think helping them to understand that this isn't a liability or a flaw. This is a signal to you that you're in learning mode. So if you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea what I'm doing, welcome to leadership, because we make it up every day. Every day is a new business problem. I almost printed a t-shirt during COVID that said, I literally have no idea what I'm doing, because during COVID, none of us did. Mm-hmm. And so we'd, get into a room and it's like, well, what do you think we ought to do? And we'd come up with something and we'd talk to the franchisees and we'd ask them, what do you think that that we should do? And they'd be like, we don't know either. So let's try this. And so it's really about just doing your best to bring your best self forward and being willing to listen to the other people in the room, come to the best decision, and then own it. And it's not always going to be right. But middle management, I don't know that many companies really take the time to empower their people to feel comfortable that, yeah, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to feel uncomfortable, but it's normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd almost call that agency, right? How can we create agency with that middle management team so they feel the autonomy, the flexibility, the support? I think those are sort of the ingredients that go into agency. And then also, they will make mistakes and it's got to be okay too.
Yeah, and the best thing at this is what I used to the most frustrating is when you have someone that's made mistakes and they're not talking to you about it. Because if you're not willing to say, hey, we got a problem here, a problem I created, I understand what I did and I won't do that again, but I need help figuring out a solution. This is what I think we got to do. That ownership of that problem is super important to people in the C-suite. And I think that when you come into it that way, that is a signal that you are leading. That's a signal of leadership. But I think the way that we often think of it as we're growing in our careers is that if someone, quote unquote, above me finds out what I did, I'm going to be in trouble. So there's whole deflection activities that happen, and that's problematic. And I mean, you said it earlier that the problem is the training of that middle management. What I often see happen in the C-suite is that they view that as a liability in that person rather than a liability in themselves. So I always took the tack that accountability doesn't actually flow down, accountability flows up. So if a mistake is made here, we're not pointing down from the C-suite trying to figure out who to fire. We're looking inward from the C-suite saying, what should we have done to support this person so that this mistake never happened? And it's not always the case. Sometimes there are bad actors or there are people that, for whatever reason, are in the wrong roles. But in most cases, if you're looking to what you can do to solve that problem proactively at the C level, you're going to be strengthening that leadership team so that they don't make mistakes and they feel empowered to be able to bring that stuff to you.
Wow, I love that. I mean, I have worked with thousands of people, and I've never heard someone describe accountability like that. I really, really like that. And that really resonates with me because it's a huge theme right now in a lot of the conversations I'm having with CEOs, managers, leaders, whoever, right? Around, oh, how do I, make sure everybody's going in the same direction, hold them accountable, and KPIs and OKRs and all this. And I really, really like what you just said, because if that leader can't be clear on what the outcome is, how in the world are the employees going to do it?
That's it. That's it. And I think too, I mean, one of the questions you asked me in preparation for this, you always ask, what are the spikes? What are the things you're really good at? But there was one question, mental blocks, I think is what you called it. What are your mental blocks? And I think mine is a very human one that you see all the time. I'm in a Vistage group, as I mentioned to you, and in Vistage, I think half of what we talk about, if not more, is the human problems. But it's the ability to see a problem and make a change quickly, especially when that problem is coming from an employee. And I think if you can identify, I mean, it's old school 1 minute manager. If you can identify quickly where someone's going wrong before it starts to annoy you and have those conversations early, oftentimes you can turn the behavior of that person towards the sort of North Star that you're trying to paint. But if you shy away from that early on, it can be really, really tough. And I think, as you grow in your career, you get pretty good at doing this. You can see where the mistakes are being made early and you can help to guide people. But those new leaders, they're afraid to say anything. So I have a direct report who's done something wrong, and I'm just going to dance around it, and I'm not going to go in and tell them what I'm seeing. And then they do it 2, 3, 4 times, and now I'm mad. And so what I'm thinking is, oh gosh, I just need to fire this person, which was never the case. The reality is what you need to do is you need to go in and have that conversation early and often to help build that person up and guide them in the direction you want to go. But I think that middle management team is often not supported for that. We actually invested in a lot of training for key managers, particularly ones that we saw growing up into the VP level, that helped them with this particular issue, how to lead people, how to guide people, and how to give feedback.
Oh yeah, it's not a skill a lot of people have. It's
Yeah.
amazing to me. And I think with all of the work that's being done right now in the mental health field and just recognizing the brain as an organ, right, that needs care and keeping, we're finally starting to see some of that shift a little bit. But most of us did not grow up in an environment where we were taught how to give and receive feedback.
No.
And so when we become grown-ups, unless we've been given that as a skill, there's no way we're going to know how to do that. And
Yeah.
so I'm very mindful of that because I think I'm married to the kindest man, and he does not tolerate any kind of unkind behavior. And so I've spent really the last 25 years every day practicing my kind feedback,
Yeah.
and I'm really
Okay.
grateful for that. But I realize that that's not most people's experience. And so I think it's just brilliant you're teaching that to the managers, and especially the fast track type managers, the ones that are going to continue to grow in their career and add value to the organization.
Yeah, and I think, like I say, I think it's a very human problem because I mean, kindness, it's something that, I think even if people don't want to admit they value it because it feels soft, we all value kindness. We all like to be treated like, humans. But it doesn't mean that you can't give direct feedback. And there's so many great books out of it. I'm trying to think of the book where she talks about being super direct, but there was a book that made the circuit for a while.
Radical candor.
That's it,
Yes.
radical candor. And I remember reading it and I'm like, gosh, it sounds so easy when you see it in a book, doesn't it? And
Hmm.
then you try to exercise it and it just sounds mean.
Hmm.
It just
Yeah.
sounds mean. And so it's finding your own voice in that, in a way to give feedback that doesn't hurt. But I don't think it's altogether different. I'll tell you, one of the best learnings I've had is having a baby late in life. So I have a daughter who's now 9 years old, and boy, giving feedback to a 9-year old, everything stings, everything hurts. So it's a microcosm, I think, of leadership that maybe I should have done earlier in my career.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah. They really do teach us how to use our words the right way, don't they?
Yeah.
I have a 10-year-old son right now, and I watch him and I'm like, oh, there's that statement I made a week ago that he just absorbed, flipped around, and just fed back to me. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Always exciting.
Always. Well, so when we were doing the prep work, you mentioned that your leadership style, you called it a collaborative leadership style. Can you
Yeah.
just share a little bit more about what that is and how you use it in your day to day?
Yeah, it's I sort of grew up this way in my career. So I started my career not in the franchising or business world, but at the National Laboratory. And it was at a time in Los Alamos where there was a lot of really cool science going on, but you always have to be dealing with the regulatory bodies. And I just had really great mentors there, and watching how they would get a whole bunch of different stakeholders in the room that had different perspectives on something and have to align to a conclusion. And it was just a great petri dish for what I discovered in franchising, which was exactly the same thing. So in business, you can do command and control. You can just lead from the top and go there and expect everybody to come right along and follow you. But you actually get farther and you do it smarter if you can get the right people into the room to help you make strong decisions. And so in franchising, a lot of what we do is about structuring the relationship with franchisees in a way that allows them to give feedback. But so often I've seen that it's not genuine, meaning that the franchisor might come in with the priorities already set, the decisions already made, and present them to the franchisees. And there's no real opportunity for dialogue in that kind of a model. So I flipped that on its ear early on. Part of it was starting out as a franchisee and understanding that perspective. And the calendar of the year is actually dictated by the franchise advisory meetings, where they're giving us feedback about what's important to them, what they're seeing in markets, where the innovative opportunities are, where the needs are, things that they're seeing as needs that maybe we're not seeing. And then we go into our strategy sessions as an executive team at the franchisor level to figure out what the priorities are going to be based on that. So they give us the sort of playbook of what's going to be necessary to grow the brand. And by doing that, it just got things moved faster because the franchisees were super engaged. So even if we had come to the same conclusions on our own, they would not have understood it or been engaged with it. And so it would have taken a lot longer to get them on board because they would have felt like Moses on the Mount arrived again. Oop. And so doing it, the way we were doing it, where we got them in there first, mattered. And similar to what I was talking about with the team, I think the same approach applies to what you're doing with your teams. If you've finished the strategy for the year and the first time your leadership level, that middle level, hears about it is after it's all published, they don't have an opportunity for feedback. So you have to ideate, you have to kind of think about that from the C level, but then you've got to get that feedback before you finalize the plan and make sure that your leadership team is engaged with it and that they're not telling you things that you're missing. And if you have a whole calendar built around this where it's a feedback mechanism, I think that collaboration actually drives better business.
Oh my gosh, another just great thing you just said that is so often missed, right? I mean, and maybe this isn't maybe more intrinsic with the franchise model, but let me just sort of restate what you said for the broader business market that's outside of franchising.
Mhm.
Ask the people who are closest to your customers what they think should be happening in the market before you form a strategy. I mean,
That's right.
yes, duh, of course. And how often does the executive level just completely bypass what customer service thinks, or the nursing staff who's dealing with the patients, or whatever is the situation, whoever's the closest to the client or the customer, they should be feeding some of that strategy in for so many reasons. They're going to be clearer on what's needed, and you'll get the buy-in, but more as well.
Well, I think the mistake that's often made, it's a good theory, and I think that it's important, but it's missing a piece. So the statement is, let's just talk to the customer. Let's give the voice to the customer. And so they'll listen directly to the customer and get this customer feedback. But by not listening to that layer within your team that is the ones that are actually there with the customer, you're missing an element that's going to help you to really hone in on where the problems are happening. So the customer may say that the problem is, for example, the problem is that I'm not getting service fast enough. Not getting service fast enough. If you're in a restaurant, I sit down at the table and it's taking too long for my server to come. And so management at the top may think that that's a training issue. Oh gosh, we've got to train people to get there faster. But that middle layer is probably going to tell them what the real issue is, and it's that you're not staffing well enough because you're looking at a spreadsheet and you think we can do this with less people because that makes you more money. The reason the customer feels that way is not going to be solved by training people at the lower level. It's only going to be solved by adding people to that level that's right there with the customers. But it's hard to hear that. The customer is not going to tell them that, and they're going to hear something a little bit different. And I saw that a lot when we would talk to franchisees. We would get the voice of the customer, give them the voice of the customer, and talk to them about what we were seeing in it. They would give us perspective on how to correct the issues that we would not have gotten had we tried to do it on our own. They would tell us what's really needed to make this work better. And often it wasn't things that they needed to do and we needed to train them to do. It was things they needed from us. It was things they needed us to invest in. And I think that's hard because you don't want to hear it. You want to make it somebody else's problem that's further down the chain. And if we just change those people, we can, retain whatever thesis we have up here in the ivory tower. But it doesn't always work that way.
Well, yeah, and I can imagine that it can extend beyond even just the people. It could be the point of sale system. It could be the scheduling system. It could be all sorts of things that might be actually causing that problem. But if you're asking the customer, they would never know that kind of detail, that the point of sale system is hard to use or whatever, right? And so, no, I think that's another really brilliant kind of point to bring home here around this, just using this collaborative leadership model as a way to also drive strategy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think with collaborative leadership generally, I think it's a concept that's been applied in a few different ways out in the marketplace, but I don't think people have generally thought of it as part of the working model within a business. Oftentimes you see books out there, great, ways of running a business. Like I'm a big fan of Gino Wickman's Traction.
We're an EOS company too. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's focused on the C-suite. And the parts of this where you're actually engaging the entire team, then it just becomes, we've got to make sure that we all have quarterly goals and that we're all looking at those numbers and making sure that we're hitting our numbers. And it starts to get distant from that. And I think the way that it gets applied is often very focused on the C-suite piece of it, and the parts of it that are intended to be more integrated with the team get a little lost. It just becomes spreadsheets and less interaction, engagement, and real two-way communication with the people that are involved. And I think that's where, if you can structure the actual engagement of your top level management with every level of the team, it makes a big difference. One of my favorite things to do in every company I've ever been in is to basically go to breakfast with anyone. And you'll hear that, oh yeah, I'll schedule lunch with anyone. I'll do skip gap, these types of things that leaders do. I like breakfast because it doesn't get rescheduled. If you try to do lunch, you're always bumping people because by the time you get to lunch, your schedule's behind and it becomes harder. But if you meet them early for breakfast and you're talking to people from every level of your company, you start to hear things through a different point of view. And it gives people that comfort that they can actually sit and have a conversation with you and get to the point without feeling like they, have 10 minutes on your schedule and they've got to get to a hard point right away. So it's often a cup of coffee will sort of ease that a little bit differently than, trying to cram it into a meeting would.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, that's great. Well, my goodness, what an amazing interview. So I really, really love what you said about accountability trickles up. Love that. And I love what you also said about the collaborative leadership and how it can really benefit the strategy even. So this has just been a fantastic conversation. You've grown me as a leader.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being on a show like this, and just the work that you're doing here in Colorado and beyond, with the podcast that you do, I think is important for every level of a company, and there's not that much of this being done. So thank you for including me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for joining me today on How I Turn the Corner.